What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? The dream was alive at the Airlie Convention Center, a mere 50 miles from where Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. The Airlie Convention Center opened its doors to various civil rights groups, including the NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Poor People's Campaign. Tucked into the Virginia landscape, Airlie served and continues to serve as a place for people of all races to meet and discuss civil rights. The civil rights movement is commonly known to take place from the 1950s to 60s. However, it has been a long-held fight that emerged right after the abolition of slavery. Efforts from organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that took part in sit-ins all over the South to combat segregated restaurants. The Montgomery bus boycott that challenged segregation on public transportation. The Little Rock Nine who defied the segregation of public schools. The Great March on Washington. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 that made discrimination against race, color, sex, religion, or national origin illegal. The March from Selma to Montgomery in protest of black voter suppression. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 that prevented the use of a literacy test as a voting requirement. Civil rights heroes such as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Thurgood Marshall, John Lewis, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and many others who paved the way for African Americans today to be recognized as more than just second-class citizens. In 1962, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund held their first annual Civil Rights Conference at the Airlie Center. This Civil Rights Conference was in large part responsible for the enforcement of the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case that deemed the separate but equal doctrine in public schools illegal and ensured that people of all races could go to school and learn together. It changed the course of our country. The Airlie Center actually sought after the NAACP-LDF to demonstrate their goal of hosting an integration conference. Many of the meetings were said to be held in the Airlie Library. This was one of the first times you had black and white educators and lawyers coming together to break down racial barriers and preservation for future generations. Jack Greenberg, an attorney, worked closely with Thurgood Marshall and other lawyers in bringing the Brown v. Board of Education case to the Supreme Court before Greenberg became the second director of the NAACP-LDF, succeeding Marshall. He was director from 1961 to 1984, where he litigated a total of 40 cases before the Supreme Court, including Alexander v. Holmes County Board of Education, where the decision called for immediate desegregation of all public schools in the South. The NAACP-LDF still holds their annual Civil Rights Training Conference at the Airlie Center, where leading experts discuss civil rights advocacy through litigation. August 22, 1963, MLK, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and other leaders from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference met to plan the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which later was known solely as the March on Washington.
The '63 March on Washington was really all these organizations working together to bring this off. King, of course, is the final speaker, but John Lewis of SNCC spoke before him, and Philip Randolph introduced him as one of the great young leaders of our generation. Philip Randolph spoke. So there were lots of people that spoke at the March on Washington from a lot of different civil rights organizations. But by 1963, the idea that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was the only game in town was no longer true.
Among others attending the conference was NAACP-LDF Director Jack Greenberg, who MLK called on to handle all of the SCLC's demonstration cases. Sitting in Airlie's boardroom, dreaming and planning, the March on Washington began to form. In 1967, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. created the Poor People's Campaign as a sect of the SCLC. Dr. King believed that the United States was moving from the era of civil rights to human rights. His new plan was meant to bring together poor people across the U.S., regardless of race, for a new march on Washington, the Poor People's March. This march was meant to demand better jobs, homes, education, and lives of U.S. citizens who were deprived of economic justice. Dr. King, along with Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, Joan Baez, and other activists met to organize the Poor People's Campaign at the Airlie Center, where they planned the 2-week protest in Washington, D.C., which occurred in June of 1968, just 2 months after King's assassination. The journey of civil rights has not always been a straight line. There have been many trials and tribulations that had to be faced to ensure the freedom of African Americans. Trials and tribulations that African Americans still face today. The Airlie Center was a safe haven in the civil rights movement that sought out civil rights organizations and called for integration, which was pretty uncommon from a Virginian establishment. The Airlie Center was gifted to the American University. Therefore, we should be thankful that we own a piece of civil rights history and not disappoint the heroes that came before us by being insensitive to the larger issues of race relations on campus and in the United States. We should instead uphold the values that AU is founded upon and call for racial justice. American University President Sylvia Burwell has introduced the new plan for inclusive excellence to respond to AU's priority of infusing diversity, equity, and inclusion at their strategic, tactical, and operational level. Now that we have the Airlie Center and the plan for inclusive excellence, let's ask current AU students how they envision the future of AU's unity and what they can contribute to make a positive difference on campus.
I envision the future of AU to be a welcoming place for everyone who comes here, whether you're an international student or a quote-unquote minority student, or I think that you should be able to be whoever you want, especially with President Burwell's new diversity and inclusion initiative that should be enacted within the next year.
I envision the future of AU to be more diverse and inclusive in both the students that come here and the faculty that teaches here. A positive contribution that I can make to AU is being more accepting of people, as well as tolerating and being more open-minded about people who might have different views than myself.
What will you do to make a better AU?